What I'm going to do is, hopefully in the spirit of what Anne Sophie Barwich does, which is kind of step back and take a look at the structure of the field of olfaction, topics that have been going on in it, and try to give you a sense of what's working, what's not, and where we might need to go in the future. And since I've got a limited amount of time, I'm going to be as terse and as provocative as possible. So I have 5 points. 5 Punkte, yeah? Oh yeah. We begin. My first point is cooking. Weirdly enough, it applies to both what Don just said and what Barry Smith had been talking about earlier. We've been cooking with fire as a biological adaptation for hundreds of thousands, if not 1 or 2 million years in our evolutionary lineage. And this is an adaptation that's changed the shape of our face and our olfactory receptor genome. I'm taking a cue from the work of Richard Wrangham at Harvard. When we started cooking, we made the nutrients in meat and vegetable matter much easier to access. It enabled we don't have the massive jaws that are needed to tear apart fruits and husks and raw meat. Our teeth got smaller, our mouth got smaller. As Wrangham says, an alien visitor would regard us as the smallmouth ape on this planet. At the same time, fast food goes way back in our genome. It freed up a lot of time. When you get a gazelle as a chimpanzee, you have to rip it apart and tear off each shred of muscle and chew on it for quite a while. That's a long time to get the nutrient content from it. When you cook it, it's much snappier. So this has consequences for what I want to call the natural history of our sense of smell. And again, Barry mentioned it, we're really good at close-in smelling, at the savoring of food, especially by this retronasal path, coming back up the back of the throat. We're not so hot at a distance, which is probably why we domesticated dogs. So the dog, we take it hunting, is saying, gazelles 50 meters that way. And we're going, okay, and then we get it. So I don't think we're good at picking up the presence of a gazelle 50 meters upwind on the savanna, but we can spice the hell out of it in our cooking pot. And we savor it, and we know what it means. And we're also creating all kinds of new smells that were not available in the natural ecosphere, if you will. By cooking produces all kinds of different fermentation products. Think about cheeses, yogurts, burnt notes, caramelized notes. These things didn't exist until we started cooking. I know, and we released carbon in the air, and Al Gore weeps, but we did change our own biology in the act of inventing cooking. It also comes back to the issue of how we frame what we do in olfaction, how we study it. So Barry was mentioning the permanent olfactory landscape and the differences between ortho and retronasal. We probably don't, we have a different way of perceiving what's out there and tuning it out. And I would encourage people thinking about this to look at how perfumers work. I'm very practical in some of my research topics, but one of the things I noticed working in the industry was you have guys and women who are doing extremely close differentiations of different combinations of odor, and they're doing it against this intensely stinky background. If you walk into any fragrance and flavor operation, it's overpowering. And yet they're figuring out the new top note for the latest Coty fragrance against this background. So how does that happen, and how do you make odor objects come forth from the background? I think it all ties together, and it's all cooking. Point number 2, pheromones. Nobody's mentioned it yet. I'll just come out and say it. I think that the concept is useless for humans and for most mammals. So-called pheromone effects have defining characteristics that the triggering scented substance consists of one or at best a couple of molecules, that the response, the behavioral response is instant and instinctive and not learned and invariant. And it turns out, Dick Doty's written a great review called The Pheromone Myth, a long book, but it's basically an enormous legal case against the concept of pheromones having any utility, because the ones we think of as pheromones, when you look at them closely, are actually very complex mixtures, and it's the balance of mixtures that matter. It's not one triggering molecule. Also, the response that's triggered is not a fixed action pattern in the old Lorenzian sense, but it's very variable. And learning is involved as well, which kind of disposes with the idea that it's an automatic, hardwired response. So I think a lot of smell scientists have resorted to pheromones as an account in the same way that their forebears decades ago used to talk about instincts. 20s and 30s, it was an instinct for this, the maternal instinct, the fear instinct, the self-preservation instinct. If you look up instinct, you can find hundreds of named instincts. And then that, kind of with the rise of behavioralism, I guess, the instinct vocabulary just plunged. You can do a Google search and Ngram of it, and it just went off the cliff. And you can do the same thing with the term pheromones, and you see we're pretty much a couple feet down from the edge of the cliff and plunging fast. So I think its utility as conceptually is gone. It's like a pair of stretch pants that fits everything and therefore nothing. So I no longer believe in human pheromones. That said, I do believe very strongly in human chemical communication. Again, as our earlier speakers pointed out, when you smell another person's body odor, you can identify health status, you can identify sexual maturity, sexual availability. This is how mothers recognize infants, how lovers recognize one another. When I smell somebody at the gym, I'm learning stuff about them and vice versa. Those are all communications that go on. I think this is one of the most interesting areas currently in olfaction, this kind of the social cognition that goes around and what exactly those messages are in the body odor. Just to name a name, Bettina Pausa in Germany has some very interesting work on how you perceiving the odor of somebody else's sweat when that sweat has been produced by working on a treadmill or taking an oral exam at a German university. And the sweat basically is, you can't discriminate it if you're asked to, if you're given money to, you can't tell which one's which, but the exercise sweat lights up areas in your brain that are innocuous, while the fear sweat, the anxiety sweat from the exam, lights up areas recognizing social anxiety in your own brain. So in a way, the emotion of anxiety could be contagious, which is actually a very old concept coming back into vogue. My third point is about how good are we? How good is the human nose? I think Don mentioned this as well. We're just as sensitive. In terms of pure sensitivity, how high a concentration of a particular chemical does it take for us to detect it? If that's the test, that's the measure, pure sensitivity, our nose is as good as any other mammals. It's as good as dogs and rabbits. Matthias Alaska has put together a huge data set of animal experiments and human studies, and given the concentrations of detection for all kinds of chemicals, we score very, very highly. So I think the superior sensitivity of dogs, dogs devote more of their brain to smelling and thinking about what's going on and analyzing the messages of it. And they're also closer to the ground. They don't mind looking for bombs when we train them to. It's hard to pay people to crawl around JFK's carousels and sniff the luggage. But it's possibly something we could do, given our abilities. But the dog myth, I think, is, it comes back to a philosophical heritage. I think it's part of this sort of depressing Greco-Freudian legacy that denigrates the human nose, that it's not necessary. Smell is something that's only of interest to children, women, and primitive peoples. It was Freud. That smell is somehow gross, and the Greeks were not so big on it. And it was lingering in the quote from Kant as well. Point number 4 is the wonderful world of molecules. How do we deal, what the nose is doing is dealing with these hundreds of thousands of volatile odors that are potentially smellable, that exist in the world. Everything from the fumes of a volcano to body odor to Chanel 5. And yet we're making sense of this. And I think there's 2 interesting elements. One's kind of inside our brain, and the other one is outside in the world. The Lang limit, what I call the Lang limit, named after David Lang in Australia, an Australian psychologist who did a lot of work on odor combinations. the Lang limit is an upper boundary on human olfactory cognitive ability. So when you're presented with a mixture of odors of 1, 2, 3, 20, 40 different things in a bouquet, typically you're able to extract and smell 1, 2, maybe 3, at tops 4 individual components from that bouquet. And as Don Wilson has pointed out, we tend to treat these complex mixtures as singular objects. So there's the 600 or 800 volatiles in coffee, each one of which we can smell individually if we had them, but all put together, it just hits us as coffee, or maybe a heavy roast, dark roast, light roast, but it's coffee. So I think this informs how we should go about looking at smell. It also tells us why David Susskind's horrible novel, Perfume, The Story of a Murderer, is just so misinformed. I mean, it turns things upside down. His hero in that book can sniff and immediately know every smell down to its individual constituents. He can sniff something and know, oh, that's a perfume made up of X, Y, Z. It's not how it works. It's obviously, I mean, we're often in the realm of magical realism at that point. And heavy National Socialistic analogies, if you're into that. So, okay, that's inside the brain. Then outside the brain, in the real world, we've got, from a purely chemical point of view, again, hundreds of thousands of different odors, all potentially smellable. And yet it turns out that a few hundred, less than 1,000, just a few hundred odors keep popping out of the GC mass spec when we make a chemical analysis. Whether we're analyzing ripe Satsuma plums or spoiled sardines or off notes in Sauterne, whatever it is, there's one bunch of, a very tiny fraction of all the available smells in the world are actually turning out to be characteristic and kind of key of any given smell. So there's a lot out there. Odor's potentially limitless. Leslie Vosshall and Andreas Keller had a very interesting paper about our ability to smell perhaps upwards of 1 trillion different odors. When you put things in combination, ask people, are these same or different, and you do some really weird n-dimensional space packing math, which I can barely follow, but which is fascinating, you can make estimates of how many potential discriminations we can make with our nose, and it's an astounding number. Nevertheless, we're able to reduce this to a manageable number. We don't go around dazzled and confused from our nose. Things pretty much make sense to us. The fifth and final point I want to make is kind of a nod to Stuart Firestein, who's late in life made a virtue of failure. His book named Failure, Oxford University Press, which is a great exploration of how failed experiments actually can be as informative as ones that succeed, and how scientists proceed on a daily basis to get at truth. I think sensory and psychological science have kind of stalled out in helping us illuminate what the natural history of odor perception is. We can do some things. Previous speakers pointed out that we can test you and tell you fairly precisely if you have an impaired sense of smell. We can tell you how bad off you are. But there's no test to tell how good you are. There's no test to select which among you might be excellent perfumers or fragrance evaluators or, bomb sniffers. We don't actually have that. We don't even know what the parameters of good smelling are. What makes a good smell sensitivity is not the only part of the game. I've worked and tested many perfumers whose noses are average noses. I mean, barring a deviated septum or a very specific anosmia to 1 or 2 discrete molecules, their noses are like yours and mine. What they're able to do involves a higher level of cognitive functioning, remembering odors, comparing odors, and importantly, imagining how 2 smells mixed together might smell as a combination. So in the same way, I have perfect color vision. I'm not able to match a tie to a colored shirt to a jacket. I have to turn around to the guy, the Brooks Brothers salesman, and he either goes, or that That's how I do it. Other people have not only good color vision, but they have that flair for combinations. And I think that's the visual analogy to perfumery. So the nose is fine, but they're able to anticipate what goes together, what would make nice, pleasing combinations, and what emerges from them. Beginning back in the 1960s, the field got dominated by smell memory studies. That was kind of the memory and learning were big academic topics in psychology. Trig Engen at Brown University jumped on the bandwagon and began noticing the supposedly Proustian features of smell. Well, okay, I've gotten the flag, I've gotten the skunk. Let's just say, long story short, Proustian odor memory is basically a crock, I think. The academics wasted decades on this topic. It's a canard, it's not worth wasting time on. And I think we have some other crocks in the world. One of them might be the limited vocabulary one that we've been hearing a lot about. There's a number of papers on smell has a depauperate vocabulary that, unlike the other senses, we have very limited words for describing smells, which is something I'd challenge. I think it's a sort of I think it's a seeping over of the postmodern view of language into what ought to be really a much more empirical effort. So where should we be going? 2 quick points about what are some promising areas. I think one is BO. I'm a big fan of BO these days. There are a lot of good studies happening. We can now genetically sequence the bacteria in the armpit, and each of these bacteria consume different ingredients in the perspiration in the axilla and produce a different set of noxious byproducts that we battle with antiperspirants and deodorants. There are racial differences in this. There are male and female differences in this. There are also differences depending on diet. And so I think this is now coming into real focus and within reach of some clever chemists, and we're going to be seeing some great advances in this area very soon, and also possibly whole new ways to deal with your social anxieties. The other one I think is we need to look at, coming back and closing on this idea of the natural history of smell, how do we perceive? One topic is natural categories. When you talk about color, we all know that there's a spectrum of color, and yet we have a limited number of color names. Ooh, it's limited. There's only about 12 colors when you get right down to it. There's the rainbow colors, gray and black and brown, and that pretty much covers it. And you can ask pre-literate tribesmen, you can ask nomads and Inuit peoples, and basically everybody carves the continuous spectrum of light up into the same groups. Red goes from here, this frequency to this frequency, maybe a little shift here for one group or another, but it's basically the same carve up. We don't know how we carve up the smell world perceptually. We don't know the structure of odor perception space. When does a woody floral note edge into, oh, that's woody now? Somewhere in there is a dividing point, and I think we need to take after Darwin and sort of try to carve nature at the joints, and then we'll have, with a much more rich description of the phenomenology of smell, I think we'll have a better chance at explaining it well. Thanks.